Good evening, I'm Andrew Chang. Tonight, Canada confronts the coronavirus pandemic. The Prime Minister's wife tests positive for COVID-19. Both are now in isolation.
Try and maybe limit some of those interactions.
The growing movement to reduce health risks.
I'm Adrienne Arsenault in Baltimore, the center of the global battle against the virus. How scientists here are tracking where it is and where it's going next. Their take on Donald Trump's plan to ban some travel.
I think our entire focus has been wrong.
The worst day on the stock market in decades. Is Ottawa doing enough to protect the economy? Rosie and Ad Issue are here. And what you need to know about the virus, the test, and keeping you and your family safe. Extensive coverage. This is The National. Well, any lingering doubt is gone. The coronavirus outbreak is accelerating. Tonight, the world is reacting and responding, while here in Canada, the impact on daily life is growing. Markets tanked again. More schools are closing, major events are being canceled, all while experts warn that a dramatic spike in cases is coming. Tonight, we examine the latest on the outbreak, what's changed, and the response, along with the implications for you, your family, and how you work. Now let's start with the cases in Canada. The virus is reaching new communities and new provinces, while BC, one of the hardest hit, has advised avoiding all non-essential travel outside Canada. Manitoba and Saskatchewan each announced their first positive tests for COVID-19. Alberta is seeing 4 new cases, so 23 there now in total. There are 8 more in Quebec. They've got 17 cases. British Columbia is up 7 cases to 53 total. And in Ontario, there are 60 confirmed, 17 of them emerging over the past 24 hours. Now, we do have major news out of Ottawa tonight. We've learned the Prime Minister's wife, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, has tested positive for COVID-19. She and Justin Trudeau are in isolation. David Cochran walks us through what this means for them and the country.
It was only Wednesday that Justin Trudeau was asked if he had been tested for COVID-19 and said no.
J'ai pas eu de test.
Now the Prime Minister is in isolation for 14 days after his wife, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, tested positive for COVID-19. The test done after she experienced mild flu-like symptoms following an appearance at a Wee Day event in England.
I'm sure I speak for all members when I convey our best wishes to the Prime Minister and his wife and any other parliamentarians who may be affected by symptoms, and wish him a speedy recovery. 2
other cabinet ministers, Mary Ng, the Minister of Small Business, and Natural Resources Minister Seamus O'Regan are also in self-isolation. So is NDP leader Jagmeet Singh and a growing number of backbench MPs.
We need to continue to listen to our medical experts. They are telling us that the situation will get worse before it gets better.
Before his wife tested positive, the Prime Minister canceled his meeting with the premiers, even though some of them were already in Ottawa.
But that's just an indication of how quickly events are developing. And so we are all rightly concerned about the global crisis that we are facing.
This won't be the end of it. A committee of MPs had 2 meetings to discuss options to keep MPs and staff safe. Sources say that could include an extended shutdown of the House of Commons.
So, Andrew, we have a statement from the Prime Minister's office tonight with a comment from Sophie Gregoire Trudeau. She thanks people who have reached out to her, saying, "Although I'm experiencing uncomfortable symptoms of the virus, I will be back on my feet soon. Being in quarantine at home is nothing compared to other Canadian families who might be going through this, and for those facing more serious health concerns." So, Andrew, a difficult situation, but a positive attitude from Sophie Gregoire Trudeau so far tonight.
Right, fair enough. But I mean, the PM is in isolation for 2 weeks. How does this affect his capacity to lead?
Yeah, this is an extraordinary situation, having the Prime Minister in isolation like this. But what the Prime Minister's office tells us is that the Prime Minister will continue to fully assume his duties. He will address Canadians tomorrow, presumably through video. And we have to reinforce he is feeling fine. The Prime Minister has no symptoms. He just has to isolate. In fact, he's going to go ahead with a telephone or a video meeting with premiers and national Indigenous leaders on Friday. And even today, before the positive test, Andrew, he was speaking with the Prime Minister of Italy, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, U.S. President Donald Trump, talking to key G7 allies and how they're going to coordinate their G7 response, or their COVID-19 response. So the plan is business as usual, even though nothing is usual. And a key point here is that even though he's in isolation, and even though Sophie Gregoire Trudeau has tested positive, the Prime Minister will not be tested, and they say that is on the advice of doctors. And Andrew, if you look at their entire response to COVID-19, it has been led by science and medical advice, and they're not going to deviate from that, even when it involves the Prime Minister's personal health.
Okay, David Cochrane in Ottawa tonight.
Thank you.
Now today, the Ontario government took a drastic step to slow the spread of COVID-19. After March break next week, it's canceling classes at all public schools for 2 additional weeks. That affects about 2 million students. And as Thomas Daigle shows us, for parents, it was a very sudden surprise.
Right on.
Like many Ontario parents, Christine Gauthier is getting ready for 3 whole weeks of this.
But that'll be only because you released.
Her daughter Fiona at home for an unexpectedly extended break.
I thought maybe the schools would close, but it was just like an extra 2 weeks. Wow, what are we gonna do?
She's left scrambling. Consider just this morning, Premier Doug Ford encouraged worry-free March break travel.
I just want the families and their children to have a good time. Go away, have a good time, enjoy yourself.
Within hours, though, Ontario's top public health expert warned traveling abroad would mean self-isolating upon return.
We've had just recently a lot of cases from various parts of the USA, and so that concerns us in that regard.
The worry? Families could bring back the coronavirus.
Good afternoon, everyone.
So the education minister announced all publicly funded schools would close for an extra 2 weeks to try to slow the spread.
We recognize the difficulty this imposes on so many members of society.
It's already been a tumultuous year for Ontario schools, with parents scrambling for childcare more than once. Now this.
Between the unknown of the strike action, which every week was sort of new news, and then now this, it's sort of like, okay, well, trying to keep it together.
We're fortunate enough to have some flexible work hours, so we can stay in and do some fun things.
Playing games.
Who's going to do more homework?
Not me. Not me.
As for Gauthier, she's just hoping Fiona will make up for lost time.
I feel like it's a lot of school to be missing, you know? I'm trying to help my daughter with her math and her French.
And there was nothing.
Even during the extended break, the province is looking for a way to keep kids focused on learning. Somehow. Thomas Daigle, CBC News, Toronto.
Now, today also marked a substantial shift in the way several other provinces are handling the outbreak.
It's a major change, I understand that, but the situation is very critical.
Quebec's government has gone into what its premier calls emergency mode. As of today, all travelers returning from any foreign country are being asked to self-isolate for 14 days. And for public servants, that quarantine isn't merely a suggestion, it's a requirement. The province is also canceling all indoor events with more than 250 people.
We are advising British Columbians against all non-essential travel outside of Canada, and that includes the United States.
Officials in BC urging people to reconsider their travel plans, and those who do leave the country also being told to self-quarantine for 2 weeks upon their return. The province has also taken an unprecedented step, calling on retired doctors to re-register, asking them to come back to work in light of this pandemic. Officials say it's a proactive step in case BC's healthcare system gets overwhelmed. And the first known cases of children being infected in this country are being reported. Calgary shut down this daycare after a 2-year-old tested positive for this coronavirus following a family vacation to the U.S. Every child, their families, and the 24 staff members from the facility have been told to self-quarantine. And in Ontario, officials say a baby boy was among the 17 new cases in the province. He was said to be in close contact with another patient. So all of this has left Canadians with plenty of questions. To answer some of them, we're joined by infectious disease specialist Dr. Abdu Sharkawi. And Dr. Sharkawi, a lot has changed over the last 24 hours. Tell me, what should Canadians be doing to prepare over the next 24 hours?
Well, I think first of all, Canadians can expect that things are going to become a lot more inconvenient over the next 24 hours. We can anticipate that there are going to be long lineups and crowds in places that we ordinarily frequent for our everyday activities in grocery stores, banking facilities, and the like. I think we all need to take a step back and really pare down things to minimalism and decide for ourselves what's absolutely essential. When it comes to groceries, my wife was at Loblaws and she came back 2 hours later like she had gone through a war. I think you have to prepare with common sense alternatives, maybe looking at online alternatives for getting your groceries, looking at getting your prescriptions renewed, urgent medical business, anything that you think really can't wait until next week perhaps or beyond, you probably want to take care of sooner rather than later because we probably anticipate things are going to get much worse before they get better.
And in terms of just how quickly things have been shifting, the ground underneath our feet, I mean, tell me a little bit more about what we ought to expect.
Well, in terms of the number of cases, I think we can expect that that's going to accelerate. There's going to be an emergence of new cases that are probably going to be spawned both from within the community and from travel links that we hadn't anticipated, including in particular the United States.
Dr. Sharkawi, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Now, limiting exposure to this coronavirus is what's behind the cancellation of a number of major public events. Among them, this Sunday's Juno Awards in Saskatoon. They're off. The Canadian Screen Awards, planned for March 29th, canceled. In New York, Broadway shows are closed for at least the next month, and spectators were barred from today's lighting of the Olympic torch in Athens. Also, many professional sports leagues are either restricting fans or suspending games altogether. That's the situation with Major League Baseball, the NBA, and the big one for many Canadians, the NHL. Here's Cameron McIntosh on how that could all pan out.
Watch your back.
In Josh Mezojednik's kitchen, it's a simple recipe. When the Winnipeg Jets play, business is good.
We get super busy. We'll fill up, right away around 5, 6 o'clock.
So, to suspend the season.
It's quite unfortunate that it's come to this, but it's also understandable. Whatever we could do to prevent the risk of exposure.
When the NHL comes back and how it will all work is still up in the air, says the owner of the Jets.
It's just too early to tell whether we're in a postponement or a cancellation. We really have to, yield to the science.
In a statement, the NHL said it's following the advice of health experts, encouraging players and staff to take all reasonable precautions, including self-quarantine if necessary.
It really is going to start to have knock-on effects, and that could easily spill over into the broader economy too.
Sports economist Moshe Lander says the move by the NHL and other leagues will be disruptive to bottom lines. The NBA and NHL both make a lot of money in the lead up to and during the playoffs.
It really is not just a mix of whether you're a large market or a small market, it's whether you're going to be in the playoffs and how long that run is going to be.
In Toronto, Raptors and Leafs fans reluctantly support it.
I guess it's definitely devastating for sports fans like us.
A lot of people are dying, so I think it's a safe and important move.
It's not just sports. Those venues host other events. For concession and other temporary workers, it means lost work. Josh Goslin sets up stages.
But they said, well, we're going to be out of work for like a couple months.
The 1919 Stanley Cup final was canceled over the Spanish flu. Chipman is optimistic there will be a champion in 2020.
I could see it going into July.
And from the NHL and other leagues that have announced cancellations and delays, there's a common message to fans and especially ticket holders. Bear with us. Cameron McIntosh, CBC News, Winnipeg.
Now again, these cancellations are based on the speed and spread of this outbreak. So let's take a wider look at the situation. So far, the number of confirmed cases globally is more than 128,000. There are more than 1,500 cases in North America. That number keeps ticking up, with at least 150 in Canada. Now, these red clusters certainly tell one story, but there is another side to it. Since this outbreak began, more than 68,000 people have recovered. That's good news, but it may take time for that to translate to investors. We did see more record-setting drops. The Dow down by 10% and the TSX 12%. Aaron Saltzman has more on another stop-and-start day.
What can I get for you today?
The wave of selling started overnight in Asia and Europe. By the time North American markets opened, it was a full-on tsunami. New York and Toronto falling so far, so fast, it triggered automatic trading halts. The second time that's happened this week. This time, the catalyst was the U.S. president.
We will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days.
Check out the straight line down the minute Donald Trump started talking about travel restrictions. Follow that up today with yet another cascade of concerning coronavirus news, and the result.
Well, you saw the worst day in financial markets since 1987 in the United States, and in Europe, the worst day ever.
The worst day ever in Canada, too. Meanwhile, the warnings keep coming from fiscal policymakers.
COVID-19 has been a major shock to the growth prospects of the global economy and the euro area economy.
What then should individual investors be doing now?
I'm focused on helping them manage their fear and ensuring that they make decisions that are based out of logic as opposed to based out of fear, because decisions based on fear are generally the ones that you regret.
It's too late to make wholesale changes now, she says. If you can't handle the volatility, make the move to more conservative holdings before the next crisis. Retiree Jim Allen's portfolio is already low risk, but with most of his income coming from his investments, these are still uneasy times.
I think this will come back. We don't know when.
So he'll ride it out, he says. At this point, there may be no other choice. Aaron Saltzman, CBC News, Toronto.
So, between basketball, hockey, large gatherings, schools across Ontario, it can feel as if society itself is getting cancelled. But with the risk of COVID-19 slamming into Canadian emergency rooms and ICUs, experts say each time someone avoids the virus, they buy time for everyone else. Christine Burak gives us a primer on the power of social distancing.
Putting at least a meter between yourself and someone who might be sick isn't always easy.
This is roughly the distance that's being recommended. So if you're near someone, is this comfortable?
Considering the situation, yes.
For others, it seems unrealistic.
Honestly, like in crowded areas, probably not.
Scientists say social distancing can make a difference if done early enough.
This virus moves really quickly, and that's what we really need to try and work on in terms of mitigation right now.
Singapore and South Korea both have large numbers of infections, but they're keeping people apart. No big gatherings. They even have drive-through virus testing. Unlike Italy, neither country has locked down its residents, but the pace of outbreaks has slowed down, and researchers say Canada could do the same.
It's not outside the realm of possibility.
The research isn't peer-reviewed yet, but models at the University of Toronto suggest even if they find and isolate mild cases, half of the people in Ontario could become infected. But with social distancing measures, people working from home, school closures, canceling of sports events, concerts, and conferences, models show the number of new infections drops significantly, allowing hospitals to keep up with the number of sick patients.
Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet here. There's not going to be one intervention that we can do that's going to make this go away. But I think that social distancing is a really key component.
What do we do on a daily basis where we're in close contact with people around us? And what can we do to try and maybe limit some of those interactions?
Keeping people apart will be socially disruptive and economically damaging, but scientists insist it will also save lives. Christine Burak, CBC News, Toronto.
So, keep your distance, but what if you get sick? We'll take a closer look at the COVID-19 test itself and how it works. Plus, fallout from those contradictory messages from the White House last night.
I don't think there was confusion.
And Adrian was at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore today, where experts are tracking the virus.
Infectious disease specialists here are not just looking at where the virus has been, they know where it's likely going. What they've discovered about how the virus behaves and how quickly it could spread, that's next on The National.
are back with our top story, the unrelenting growth of the COVID-19 pandemic. That's why Adrian is in Baltimore tonight.
That's right, Andrew. This is the home of Johns Hopkins University, a specialized medical research center tracking the spread of the coronavirus. In one sense, this galloping threat comes as no surprise to the experts here. Back in October, they ran a simulation that anticipated just this kind of outbreak and how it would multiply, with cases doubling every week. Just a little bit later, I'll show you what else they found. But first, let's check out the impact here in the United States of Donald Trump's surprise announcement last night, a 30-day ban on travel from Europe starting tomorrow at midnight. Paul Hunter has the political fallout from a speech that wasn't quite right.
In efforts to calm his jittery fellow Americans, Donald Trump last night misspoke.
We will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days.
In fact, it's not all travel. Americans in Europe and U.S. legal residents will be allowed to come home. Today, the vice president clarified.
I don't think there was confusion. They'll be screened, and then we're going to ask every American and legal resident returning to the United States to self-quarantine for 14 days.
Meanwhile, airlines are scrambling to figure out what it all means for them, how they'll deal with the sudden change in travel from Europe. And though the UK is exempt from Trump's ban, the rest of the continent is more than a little put off by it, stunned that it hadn't even been consulted before Trump took action.
We get along very well with the European leaders, but we had to make a decision, and I didn't want to take time.
A larger question, is there merit to the ban anyway?
Banning all travel from Europe or any other part of the world may slow it, but as we've seen, it will not stop it.
Still, one of the leading scientists helping direct U.S. policy on the virus today underlined the ban was the right call. It will help.
New cases throughout the world, the majority of them are from Europe to other countries. If you look in the United States, at states that have new cases, the majority of them are coming from that region. It was based on that the travel restriction was suggested and accepted.
It's Trump's biggest crisis since taking office. His response watched carefully as the country wonders where any of this goes from here. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Washington.
So now let's see how Trump's announcement has stirred things up in Europe, where 22,000 cases of COVID-19 have now been confirmed, according to the World Health Organization. And now there is a looming deadline for some to get out. Briar Stewart shows us that.
Across Europe this morning, a rush to airport terminals. In those long lines, plenty of anxiety and confusion.
There's definitely been a lot of uncertainty, which has caused a lot of panic.
We're supposed to leave on Sunday, and now we're trying to get home earlier, obviously. It's actually our honeymoon.
There are reports some were so desperate to get a new ticket out, they paid thousands of dollars extra. Some passengers weren't aware U.S. citizens are exempt from the ban. Others didn't want to take any chances, given how quickly countries are tightening their coronavirus controls.
À toutes les personnes âgées de plus de 70 ans.
Today, Emmanuel Macron urged elderly people and those with health issues to stay at home for as long as possible. France, along with Ireland, joined a growing list of European countries closing schools and universities, all in an attempt to slow the spread of COVID-19 and avoid the fate of Italy, where more than 1,000 have died. This Italian actor pleaded to have someone come and pick up the body of his sister, which remained in the family home with him for 36 hours before it was removed. Outside, along the eerily deserted streets here, a sense of dread that this is far from over.
We are worried for the future because what is happening here probably could happen also in other parts of Europe.
And it's starting to, which is why governments are rolling out plans and preparing the public.
More families, many more families, are going to lose loved ones before their time.
UK officials say the spread of the virus here is likely 1 month behind Italy. Unlike other countries, the UK government hasn't shut down schools or restricted mass gatherings, saying it's too early for such drastic measures because the peak here might not be until the end of May. Briar Stewart, CBC News, London.
The U.S. president has said COVID-19 took the world by surprise, but it didn't really. Here in Baltimore, armed with reams of data and cold hard math, researchers modeled exactly how an outbreak like this, a coronavirus outbreak, would unfold months ago. The virus is behaving as predicted. The surprise is the reaction from some governments, including the United States.
This board has been urgently convened by the World Economic Forum.
It was a new coronavirus and spreading fast, killing 7% of those infected.
We could be looking at double the number of cases in 1 week.
That was the drastic fictional scenario drilled at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore last October, with health and industry officials from around the world imagining the what-ifs.
I worry we're suffering from a delusional disorder.
If they contribute more, that they will have a better chance.
You need the money. So where's the money?
Within 8 weeks, it had all happened. The real COVID-19 is less lethal, but the disruptions are exactly as anticipated. The stock plunges, stranded cruise ships, canceled events, all unfolding on schedule as they did in the simulation. Back in October, made-up newscasts told the stories.
Public health agencies have issued travel advisories.
Dr. Eric Toner ran the October simulation, said it was clear then to all the nations participating that travel bans didn't work, caused enormous economic harm. In the simulation, a few countries still went ahead with them, but not many. What did you think when you heard the president's travel ban last night?
Well, I think travel bans are ill-advised. They are counterproductive. They certainly would not do anything useful currently. There's plenty of COVID-19 in the United States.
So you were mad last night?
I was disappointed. I think we've been focused on the idea that we could contain the disease elsewhere, keep it out of this country. I think that was obviously not true from the very beginning. And we should have been spending the last 2 months getting prepared.
The future? Johns Hopkins runs an hourly interactive map of the infections. Watch North America, France, and Germany to change fast, Dr. Toner says. An infection rate doubling roughly every week, just as predicted. And we've been doing some more talking with those who model pandemics and their responses. And so next week, Andrew, we will go through what they anticipate will happen next and where, and crucially, what needs to happen right now to make this a little less painful for everyone and certainly to save some lives.
Yeah, critical information, absolutely, Adrian. And up next, we will have more need-to-know information for you, including a closer look at how the COVID-19 test itself works. And Rosie is back with that issue.
Andrew, there sure is a lot to talk about. A global health pandemic, growing economic concerns, and of course, the political response. Chantal, Andrew, and Paul Wells will join me after the break.
This is a public health crisis that we have not seen in recent times.
Our government will do whatever it takes to keep Canadians healthy and safe.
We've been in constant communication with all the provinces and territories.
We do work very closely and collaboratively with our counterparts in the United States.
We're following the science and the evidence.
That's been some of the messaging from the federal government today on COVID-19, but the situation is obviously a fast-moving one. So how does the government manage this crisis? How is it managing it? It's Thursday. I'm here with At Issue. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Paul Wells is with us tonight in Ottawa. Good to see everybody. Just from the perspective of how the government is managing yet another crisis, this one a pandemic that is personally affecting them, given that they are with self-isolating today. I guess in terms of tone and leadership and the kinds of things that a government needs to do in a moment like this. Chantal, do you want to start?
Well, I guess the first thing is that there is no roadmap for this, but there is no sense in thinking that it's going to be a small thing. There is previous experience now in Italy and China, and what's happening in France and Spain. It all sends the same signals. I was listening to Question Period today, and the answers from the government were vague, but the subtext seemed to be that the government expects and is waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Andrew?
It's been an uncertain response, but forgivably so, because this is an extremely difficult thing to get one's arms around. When you're dealing with exponential growth, potentially exponential growth in caseloads such as we've seen, I think they've been a little bit behind the curve, shall we say, but it's dawning on them as it's dawning on the rest of the public how serious this is and how serious it potentially could be.
Paul, what do you make of their approach so far, their tone so far?
I think the Trudeau government has benefited from having had good players in place already, almost by accident. Theresa Tam, the head of the Public Health Agency, was appointed by Jane Philpott, mostly to look after the opioid crisis, which continues. Patty Hajdu, the health minister, turns out to be one of the most poised and confident and reassuring presences in this government. And it should be said that the federal government is not in charge of any kind of response to a crisis on this scale. Provincial governments, city halls, public health agencies right across the country, and ordinary Canadians who traditionally have been very good at following smart advice in good faith. And I think all of that has led to the early stages of this crisis not being as bad as it could be. I make no predictions for next week.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that has struck me is the way, one person said to me, the sort of deference to science that you're seeing as opposed to what is happening in the United States, for instance.
Yes, but deference to science is well indicated in this case. Justin Trudeau is about as knowledgeable of public health issues in the sense that is needed as we all are tonight. So if we didn't have science and medical experts to rely on, but also the experience of the countries who have been going through this on a larger scale for a bit longer than we have, what would you like to rely on? I don't think we should ever measure the quality of our government's response by the standards of what is happening in the U.S.
I knew you were going to say that to me, yes.
Well, because
you're right.
if we do that, we're not setting the bar low. We are setting the bar below any acceptable level.
But it's a critical asset, though, that you still have levels of trust in this country that seem to be rapidly disappearing in the United States. You know, if the experts are right in some of their grimmer projections on this, we're going to need to mobilize society on a grand scale to fight this, both in the sense of being willing to accept quite draconian restrictions imposed by government, and in the sense that Paul referred to of being willing to make alterations in our own lifestyle. To mobilize people, a society like that, they have to trust in their leaders, they have to trust in experts, they have to trust to some extent in the media. On all these scores, we do quite a bit better than the United States. I realize that's setting a low bar.
That's a good point. Let me turn a little bit to the economic uncertainty that the coronavirus creates by the shutdown of the tourism industry and all sorts of things, the drop in the price of oil, and a government that is still planning to table a budget on March 30th. Here's a little bit of Bill Morneau and what he said.
This economic volatility is real. So I've actually gone ahead and asked the private sector economists who help us to form the basis of our economic forecasts, come back with a refresh of their expectations.
So the government so far has put forward $1 billion package, but it was very much health-oriented, research-oriented. They say there is more there and more coming potentially in terms of the economy. Paul, that I think we can credibly talk about in terms of what the government should be doing or what more the government should be doing there.
Well, it's tricky. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, in the middle of some comparable crisis, you could expect the central bank to cut interest rates markedly, and you could expect a federal government to spend large numbers of billions of dollars through tax cuts or checks to people or spending programs. Unfortunately, interest rates have lately been close to rock bottom, and this government was already spending very close to the ability of the economy to handle it without the debt increasing in relation to the GDP. And so that doesn't leave it a lot of room to maneuver.
Chantal, go ahead.
But this is... It may be just me, but I see the upcoming federal budget as a Band-Aid on a huge wound. And that's because until this crisis is resolved, I don't think any federal budget or provincial budget is going to do more than try to fill the gaps and get people over the other side of the crisis. This is also far beyond the control of any national government. When markets are crashing the way they're crashing, the oil prices going the way they're going, no single national government will suddenly wake up at the end of March and say, here's the recipe to get out of this trouble. We've seen a number of budgets over the past few weeks that have been outdated with 2 days after they were presented. The Alberta budget, the Quebec budget this week, in surplus. Now the government in Quebec is saying we may be running into a deficit. So yeah, the budget is going to allocate money, but I think it's going to be crisis management money.
Okay, Andrew, you go ahead.
I'm skeptical of the value of fiscal stimulus at the best of times. I'm particularly skeptical of its use in fighting a pandemic. We are going to go into deficit, deeper into deficit, just because of the nature of the situation we're in. But that's just, you know, there's going to be costs to be associated with probable recession and in terms of fighting the pandemic. What I think is really essential is that the government do everything to signal that the economy comes first, that it is their first priority beyond the pandemic, that they are going to do everything to reassure and provide confidence to investors and to business.
We really are going to have to wait for the budget if he gets to implement it. I mean,
Yes.
what else is going to be canceled?
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast edition, for extra content. This week, we are going to pick up right where we left off. Look for it on any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/The National. For now, though, back to Andrew in Toronto.
And coming up, the cruise conundrum. Some Canadians are still hopping on board. Joanna Remiliotis caught up with them in Puerto Rico. And Times Square in New York. This is how most of us think of it, but wait till you see what it looks like now. Welcome back. A return to our top story tonight. The wife of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, has tested positive for COVID-19. She began to feel unwell after returning from a recent speaking engagement in the UK. Now, a statement from the Prime Minister's office said that she tested positive today and that she will remain in isolation. Beyond that, she's said to be feeling well and is getting medical attention. As for the Prime Minister himself, he's not currently showing any symptoms, but is in isolation as well. Viking Cruises, Disney Cruise Line, and Princess Cruises, which had coronavirus outbreaks on 2 of its ships, they've announced they're halting operations for weeks. But at least 90% of the industry is still booking. Joanna Remiliotis is in Puerto Rico, a hub of cruise traffic, where some travelers seem convinced it is smooth sailing ahead.
Arriving in San Juan is the first step. Almost everyone on this flight from Toronto is getting on a cruise next, coronavirus or not.
As far as getting sick, no, I'm not concerned.
I've booked this trip for a year now, and I feel that I'm just going to take that chance.
San Juan is usually the busiest cruise port in the Caribbean, but some lines, including this one, have canceled all cruises. Others are still set to sail, at least for now. This while San Juan started disinfecting popular tourist spots to contain the potential spread of infection. And today, Puerto Rico's Governor Wanda Vázquez declared a state of emergency, canceling all mass gatherings.
Hoy les anuncio al pueblo de Puerto Rico que estaré declarando un estado de emergencia.
The island has a handful of presumed coronavirus cases, including tourists who are on a cruise, and has ordered ships with suspected cases not to stop at its port. Canada has advised people not to go on cruises at all, but Canadians who docked in San Juan for the evening a couple of days ago say they're not worried.
The precautions that they've been taking on the boat have really put our minds at ease. I would say mandatory hand washing before you go into the buffet. They serve you at the buffet instead of self-serve.
They took our temperatures, to make sure that nobody was sick.
Maybe so, but back at the airport, some are playing it safe.
We canceled the cruise, but we're still going to spend the time down here.
And this group is taking a vote to decide. Their boat is supposed to pick them up on Saturday.
We know the ship's out in the ocean right now, so we'll wait to see when the ship comes back. If anybody comes off the ship that's sick or I don't know. If everything looks good, then we'll get on the ship.
Any certainty about what comes next? It seems that ship has sailed. Joanna Brumaliotis, CBC News, San Juan, Puerto Rico.
So, if you start feeling sick, what happens then?
This is what it looks like. It's a very small and quite flexible swab.
We're going to take a closer look at the COVID-19
Gets
test.
sealed up and
That's
then
up next.
gets sent off the lab.
I'm Jamie Poisson, and tomorrow on CBC's Daily News podcast Front Burner, as the response to COVID-19 ratchets up around the world, from major sports cancellations to border closures, is Canada doing enough? Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Now, one question that keeps coming up around this coronavirus outbreak is what exactly should you do if you start feeling sick, and how do you get tested? What's involved? Well, we asked Dr. Allison McGeer, who helped lead the fight against SARS, to take us through it step by step.
I'm Dr. Allison McGeer, and I'm a microbiologist and infectious disease epidemiologist at Sinai Health System in Toronto. I'm here to talk to you about what to expect if you need to be tested for COVID-19. If you think you need to be tested, what do? Well, the first thing you want to do is check with your family doctor to sort out whether you do need to be tested or not. And you want to start that process on the telephone, because if you do need to be tested for COVID-19, it's important for people to know that you might have it and to be taking the proper precautions. If you and your doctor decide between you that you do need to be tested, it may be that your doctor will have all the equipment to do it in the office. More likely that your doctor will send you to the emergency department to be tested there. There's two kinds of tests that are done. They both use the same swab, and this is what it looks like. It's a very small and quite flexible swab, and it's got a little brush on the end. And the nurse will put it into your nose, curl it up to the back of your nose, and then rotate it so that that brush brushes the cells in the back of your nose, goes into the tube, gets sealed up, and then the tube gets sent off to the lab for the test. Does it hurt to get one of these swabs done? It doesn't hurt as much as it's uncomfortable. It's just kind of an odd sensation when somebody is putting a brush, even a very small one, at the back of your nose, but it's not usually painful, and it's not the least bit dangerous. The reason that it's a swab of your nose is because this virus lives in the lining of the back of your nose and down the back of your throat. So what happens if you test positive for COVID-19? It's important to remember that most people who get COVID-19 have mild illness. In general, the cases that we've seen in Canada have been people who've not been sick enough to need to be in the hospital. So you will get sent home with instructions on how to do self-isolation at home. And you'll be in touch with your public health department, who will help you if you have questions, and who will arrange for testing so that you know when you no longer have the virus and you can come out of isolation and go back to your usual life.
Now, with lots of people rethinking their travel plans, those who do venture out may very well find an eerie scene. Tourist hotspots virtually silent. It's our moment. Next. With the call for more social distancing, countries in lockdown, near empty city centers, and pro sports suspending games, there is an unusual quiet in many places that are usually incredibly busy. It's striking to hear, striking to see. This global moment of silence is our moment tonight. strange to see such iconic places looking the way they do. And in a way, the part of that you don't really see is the human side to it, not just in terms of the people who don't get to see those sites, but all of the people who rely on the people who go to see those sites, all of those people in the retail industry, service industry, accommodations, food. There'll be a whole lot of people who hope this doesn't stay too bad for too long. That's the National for this March 12th. Have a great day.
Good evening, I'm Adrienne Arsenault.
And I'm Andrew Chang. Tonight, new coronavirus cases in Canada, and some of them appear to have been infected here.
It is these community cases that give us some degree of concern and grief.
And Ottawa prepares to take action.
Do everything we can to keep ensuring that Canadians are kept safe.
And Italy overwhelmed with coronavirus.
This situation is like a bomb that explodes.
Hospitals so swamped with patients, doctors are forced to choose who to treat.
I voted for Joe Biden.
For Biden.
A key race in Michigan. Can Joe Biden expand his lead?
I'm not pretty, but I'm smart and I'm bold. She's about to be inducted into the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. Now Jan Arden is really opening up about her family's struggles.
My brother was arrested for first-degree murder in the same month that I was signed to a record deal.
And why this award means more than any other. This is The National.
The pace of the coronavirus outbreak in Canada is accelerating. There are more infections in 3 provinces, one new one in Ontario.
In Alberta, cases doubled to 14, and in BC, 7 new cases. 2 are especially concerning. They appear to have been spread locally. So in a moment, we'll examine Ottawa's planned response to the virus. We'll take you to Italy, where hospitals are struggling to keep up with the outbreak, and we'll look at some of the drastic measures in places like New York, where authorities are canceling school and calling in the National Guard. But we begin with the concern in British Columbia. Tina Lovegreen starts our coverage.
At the care home where Canada's first COVID-19 death was recorded, 2 more cases, both healthcare workers.
They're both in isolation at home. There's been a number of testing being done on people with symptoms.
Health officials are still investigating how the virus made it into the care home, and now 2 more cases of apparent community spread are under the microscope.
These people are in isolation. We know they're close contacts. We can stop those chains of transmission so they don't continue in our communities.
There are more cases in BC, now a total of 39.
Some positive news, but of course some really challenging news for the families involved.
Some have recovered, including an 80-year-old woman who is being cared for at the hospital. But just across the border in Washington state, more than 70 new cases in just one day.
So the number of people who are infected in an epidemic like this will double in the state of Washington unless we take some real action here.
The virus has been detected at 10 different long-term care homes, causing 2 more deaths. New rules at Washington care homes have been put in place. Each patient is limited to 1 person or visit per day, and every visitor will be screened for the virus.
Talk about seniors who are living in care home setting, they are more vulnerable.
There are worries the same kind of spread will happen here.
I'm concerned because that we know that care homes is the home for many seniors, in particular those who are more frail, and that number at this point may even change further, so it is a concern.
But with BC doing more testing, officials are hopeful they'll stop the spread before things get out of hand. Tina Lovegreen, CBC News, Vancouver.
With the outbreak evolving in both Canada and abroad, and with the economic impact spreading, Ottawa has faced increasing calls for action. David Cochrane has the latest on their plans.
We recognize that there are going to be significant economic impacts for Canadians, for workers, for businesses.
To this point, the reassurances have been public, but the details largely kept private.
We're going to be talking very soon about measures that Canada's going to put forward to support people on the economic side.
It turns out very soon is Wednesday. Government sources say the Prime Minister will announce significant steps in Canada's response to COVID-19. It will include a boost to research funding to combat the virus, and government's intention to waive the one-week waiting period for EI benefits for people who can't work because of the virus.
Canadians, workers who need to self-isolate to protect themselves and to protect their neighbors.
And while the provinces run the hospitals, Ottawa has the money and the financial means to respond. So sources say Trudeau's announcement will outline ways to bolster health workers and provincial health systems.
Whether it is any anticipated shortages that they might have for equipment or personal protective gear, or even in terms of human resources, additional supports that they might need in their hospitals or in their public health units. These are the kinds of conversations we're having.
The Prime Minister will also give a detailed account of what has been done behind the scenes to slow the viral spread and limit the economic contagion.
We're going to continue to act in ways recommended by the top experts, by the top medical professionals, coordinate with other levels of government, coordinate with the international community, do everything we can to keep ensuring that Canadians are kept safe.
Trudeau's announcement will deal with the immediate pressures caused by COVID-19. There will be additional measures in the upcoming budget and more after that once the full impact of the coronavirus is known. David Cochran, CBC News, Ottawa.
Turning now to Italy, a country locked down, overwhelmed, and increasingly desperate. More than 10,000 people are now infected, by far the most outside China. More than 600 people have died, and the latest death toll is also the highest in one day so far, at 168. And as Renee Filipponi explains, doctors are now being forced to make some very hard choices.
Covered head to toe in protective gear, doctors work round the clock and compare the situation to a war zone. At some hospitals, emergency rooms and entire wards have been converted to intensive care units. Italian doctors have warnings for countries like Canada.
Your health system, no matter how good, how efficient, how modern it is, sooner or later will collapse because the number of patients is too high for the resources we have.
The situation is so bad, one specialist told local media they are overwhelmed and are having to choose who to treat. And in some cases, older patients may not get the same level of care. Underscoring the crisis for a country with the second oldest population in the world, a population most vulnerable to the virus. The entire country is under lockdown. No public gatherings, no sporting events, and no travel. At train stations, police are checking paperwork. Only those with authorized work or family reasons are allowed to travel.
Yesterday, so she booked her ticket.
CBC News met Canadian Kate Andrews in Milan last month at the beginning of the outbreak. She is now under quarantine.
We're not worried about running out of food. The neighbors are great. There's people that are there to help us, but it is a weird feeling being completely dependent on the kindness of your neighbors.
In an attempt to control the spread, Italian grocery stores are only allowing a few people in at a time and keeping shoppers a safe distance apart.
When I was paying, they made sure that there was the right distance between one person and another.
All of this has grave economic consequences. In an effort to help Italians ride it out, the government is considering suspending taxes, mortgage payments, and bills, and will vote on those measures this week. Renee Filipponi, CBC News, London.
So here now is Dr. Taslim Ninji. You're an ER doctor from Humber River Hospital, fresh off your shift, so thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
We look at Italy. It's a wealthy country, a top-tier medical system, and yet it's overwhelmed. So what does your ER look like now?
So certainly we are seeing increased volumes. We're seeing a lot more pressure on the emergency department system, especially as people are coming in even just for screening if they've had travel history or contact. And so we're starting to look at creative ways we can offset some of that volume in our emerge and in our hospitals so that we can get to our sickest patients. So that's going to look like things like screening centers that are off-site, not in the hospital, and you're going to see, I think, an increasing number of those. across the city and across the provinces. And then we're also really talking about how do we get creative about creating capacity in a system that is already close to full capacity. So we have surge mechanisms, as we call them, to get to that overage. We see those in influenza times. And now we're looking at that. So how do we get creative about creating space and capacity within our system to see these patients and treat them?
So that means maybe putting off elective surgeries, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you know what, when we are talking about that, when we need to create space, we will do things like canceling elective procedures, elective surgeries. We can use virtual care mechanisms, offsite screening, things like that.
So what does Canada's medical system, do you think, actually need to stock up on at the moment?
Yeah, so when patients are coming into the hospital requiring hospitalization because of COVID-19, we're seeing a real spectrum in terms of what they need, right from something just like supplemental oxygenation, right up through an ICU bed and ventilation. So we're really having conversations at the hospital level to look at what capacity we have for ICU beds and for ventilators as an example. And then what we really need to do is look at sharing, right? And so we do normally transport patients from hospital to hospital if we need to, because one hospital is at capacity when another isn't. How do we do that safely? And how do we do that when there's pressure on all of us as cases may continue to increase in number?
Oh, the logistics are intense. Dr. Nimji, thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Every day across North America, we see more restrictions, more cancellations, more limitations on events and on travel as officials try to buy time. Ellen Morrow looks at some of the more sweeping measures so far.
In this New York City suburb, some of the strongest containment measures yet in the U.S. Schools closed, large gatherings banned in New Rochelle, home to most of the cases in New York State.
This is literally a matter of life and death. That's not a overly rhetorical statement.
Here's your grocery delivery. In New Brunswick today, one of the strongest measures in Canada. Any staff or students returning from international travel anywhere must stay home from school for 2 weeks.
This is a directive coming from government. We expect people to comply with it because we live in a country that honors the rule of law.
This expert says banning some large events may make sense, but officials need to strike the right balance.
I think it can definitely stimulate a lot of fear in people that we're in a situation that might be worse than what we're actually experiencing right now.
There's been a domino effect with more coronavirus closures and cancellations every day. Pearl Jam postponing its North American tour. The popular Coachella Music Festival delayed until at least October. Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy ditching their studio audiences, and major U.S. universities like Princeton and Harvard switching to online classes.
You have something this big that's just causing chaos around campus, around the world. It adds a lot of stress.
That stress spreading along with the virus, but it's prudence, not panic, officials are urging.
This is a real problem, but whether or not you should be fearful of it, you know, I don't find that a helpful response.
While Canadians wonder what cancellations and closures may be coming next, officials are reminding everyone to wash your hands often and avoid touching your face. Ellen Morrow, CBC News, Toronto.
228 Canadians stranded by a coronavirus outbreak aboard a cruise ship in California are now back in Canada. So they returned on a flight from Oakland and landed at the Canadian Forces Base in Trenton, Ontario, where they will be isolated for 2 weeks. That base has become a rough and ready quarantine facility now for stranded passengers of 2 cruises. And cruise ships have been singled out as especially at risk for spreading the virus. Ottawa has warned Canadians that if you are planning a cruise, skip it and stay on land. Jonathan Gatehouse explains why.
Today is February 19.
How dangerous was the coronavirus outbreak aboard the Diamond Princess in February? A new study modeling the onboard epidemic reaches some sobering conclusions. It started with a single passenger and quickly ballooned to a rate of infection 4 times that of Wuhan, China. Left unchecked, the study suggests the disease would have eventually touched 79% of those on board, some 2,900 people. However, researchers also say that if everyone had been evacuated from the vessel when the first cases were discovered, the outbreak could have been contained to just 2%, or 76 people. More than 600 people did get sick and 7 have died. The study concludes the key factor was the ship itself. A floating petri dish where people from all over the world spend weeks in tight quarters putting their trust in the cleaning staff and everyone else's hand hygiene.
I would probably not advise anybody to go on a cruise for the foreseeable future until the situation settles down.
Yet the cruise industry says that it's safe, that they're initiating a bunch of new safeguards to make sure that everyone on board is healthy. I mean, that's a mixed message. Who should people believe at this point?
Given what we've already seen in the last few weeks, I think that it's a very difficult standard to meet.
Some experts say the coronavirus crisis points to a need to reimagine the spaces where we work, play, and travel, such as using materials that can better withstand vigorous cleaning.
If I told you that your cruise ship was going to have a vinyl headboard, you might not think that sounds really luxurious, but I assure you there are properties that we can put into vinyl now that allow it to be both comfortable, luxurious, and safe.
The cruise industry is trying to weather the storm, making it easier to cancel and rebook while slashing prices. The question is, what will win out with consumers? The lure of a bargain vacation or warnings from public health officials? Jonathan Gatehouse, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, a day after the biggest U.S. stock market plunge since 2008 and the worst drop in Canada in 30 years. Today, markets made a partial recovery. The Red Cross rang the closing bell on Wall Street, perhaps fitting for a market in medical distress. The S&P and Dow both ping-ponged before ending the day up nearly 5%. It was the same story on the TSX, but closer to 3%. Markets may have been responding to signals from the White House.
It will go away, just stay calm, it will go away. We want to protect our shipping industry, our cruise industry, cruise ships. We want to protect our airline industry, very important. Be calm, it's really working out, and a lot of good things are going to happen.
Donald Trump is reportedly mulling over a broad array of measures, including aid to airlines, support for paid sick leave, and a huge cut to payroll taxes.
And as another major round of voting is underway in the race for the White House, coronavirus concerns are making themselves felt. Both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden have canceled rallies scheduled for tonight in Cleveland, Ohio, but still preceding votes in Washington, Idaho, North Dakota, Missouri, Mississippi, and Michigan. That last one, Michigan, is the big prize with 125 delegates at stake. So the outcome of that race has the power to determine the future of Bernie Sanders' run. Paul Hunter is in Monroe, Michigan tonight, just south of Detroit. Paul.
Yeah, well, Joe Biden seems to be doing it. Who'd have thought that just a couple of weeks ago? Tonight, here in Michigan, he's won. It's a state rich in delegates and in symbolism.
Thank you.
Could it be, in the Democrats' seemingly never-ending battle to find a challenger for Donald Trump, that tonight they're finally honing in on it?
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
In Monroe City, Michigan, those we met were clear.
Yes, I voted for Joe Biden. I voted for Joe Biden.
Biden.
Why?
I feel he has the best chance to beat Trump.
For so many, it's that simple.
To get back to normalcy, it's painful for me to see what's going on in this country nowadays.
Monroe, a factory town southeast of Detroit, is itself in the spotlight, not least for its symbolism. This county twice backed Barack Obama for the White House. In 2016, it flipped and voted Trump. Monroe also favored Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton, as did all of Michigan. But all of a sudden, the landscape's changed.
I think we got to get Trump out and get a Democrat in, and I think Biden has the best chance of doing it.
So all eyes are now on these voters. Biden's been surging. It's as if voters now know who it's going to be. Joe Mentum, they call it. Sanders, who needs Michigan to reignite his campaign, this week slammed Biden for being part of the so-called establishment.
Does anybody really think that that is going to be the campaign of excitement and energy that's going to grow the base that we need to defeat Trump? I don't think so. I say that honestly as a friend of Joe's. You're full of shit.
As for Biden, he got cornered today when a factory worker accused him of plans to get too tough on hardening gun laws.
I did not say that. That's not true. I did not say that.
Still, it's not the kind of thing likely to put off voters dead set on getting rid of Trump. Even those who today voted Sanders underlined they'll back Biden if Biden takes on Trump.
I would vote for a celery stick if it could defeat
You know, she jokes, Adrian, but that's underlining how Democrats see this election. This isn't like other elections. This is about one thing and one thing only, the way they see it, and it's getting Donald Trump out of office. Tonight in Michigan, the key state of Michigan, Democrats have said their guy to do that is Joe Biden.
All right, Paul Hunter in Monroe, Michigan. Thanks, Paul.
Well, today marks 1 year since the Ethiopian Airlines disaster.
And there's not a day that we don't think of her.
Up next, we return to the crash site and hear from the families of the Canadian victims.
Plus, a spot in Canada's Music Hall of Fame.
This is absolutely the biggest one.
Why Jan Arden isn't showing any signs of slowing down.
And later, the end of the handshake.
We've kind of been doing like a little elbow bump.
How coronavirus fears are inspiring alternate greetings. We're back in 2. 1 year ago today, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 took off from Addis Ababa Airport. But just minutes into the flight, the Boeing 737 MAX 8 plunged to the ground. Everyone on board was killed, including 18 Canadians. Well, today, families and friends returned to the scene. Susan Ormiston spoke with some of them.
Too young to know why all this, snaking through their farmland. The cars and buses just kept coming, with the anxious faces of family and friends who made it back to Ethiopia a year since their worst day ever.
It is painful, but as painful as it is, the love for my wife and my children and my mom-in-law doesn't leave.
Paul and Njoroge lost all of them.
I want to commemorate their lives. I want to remember them. And I want to see that place where their flesh was left.
The crash last March left a deep crater and an open wound. The site now is gentler. Fenced off temporarily, the crater filled in. Today's memorial was private. Media kept far away, but families took their own video as villagers watched from a hillside.
My family was shattered.
Canadian Joan Vincent, who lost her daughter Angela, spoke and then shared with us.
We think constantly about the possibilities of what their life would have been.
About softening grief.
It doesn't hurt as much. So even on the times that we say their name now, we don't maybe fall apart.
And yet.
There's not a day that we don't think of her.
18 Canadians died on this ground of the 157 from across the world. Families consider this place sacred ground. The only things they have left of their loved ones, a piece of clothing, a passport, came in boxes to their homes as late as October. The government has buried small coffins here with remains that were too tiny to be identified, so this is a special place. Clarisse Moore struggled with her grief this week, stuck on the date her daughter died.
It doesn't give me any comfort or anything, but I just want to see it again. The place where I know part of Daniel's still here.
As they return to their homes across the world, they still want to know who will be held responsible for this doomed flight, and how will this never happen again. Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Garabukan, Ethiopia.
Now, among the Canadians who died in the crash, 24-year-old Danielle Moore. Today, her father marked the anniversary by protesting outside Transport Canada.
So it's in memory of my daughter that I'm doing this. She was a fighter, and she stood for justice. And there's been a travesty here.
Chris Moore says the biggest question he still has is why Transport Canada didn't ground the Boeing 737 MAX 8 4 months earlier when there was another crash. That one was also blamed on Boeing's flawed anti-stall system. A House committee is holding public hearings into the MAX 8, but Moore says that doesn't go far enough. He wants a full-blown inquiry.
Here are some of the other stories we're watching across Canada tonight. A 6-year-old girl was seriously injured after a suspicious fall from a balcony at this Toronto apartment building. Police say they received a call this afternoon and arrived to find the child in medical distress outside the building. She was taken to hospital in serious but stable condition. It's still unclear how she fell or from what floor.
At Quebec, what happened
in Quebec on January 22nd is an absolute tragedy.
Top parole and corrections officials express condolences for the death of 22-year-old Marilyn Levesque, a sex worker killed in January by a convicted murderer out on day parole. During 2 hours of questioning on Parliament Hill today, officials vowed to take steps to prevent another incident like this from happening again. The parole officers involved in the case have been suspended from supervising offenders.
This is not about the last 6 years. This is about the next 50 years of this province. It was important for us to actually make sure that we leave no stone unturned.
Premier Dwight Ball says police will be investigating Newfoundland and Labrador's troubled Muskrat Falls hydroelectric project. This comes more than 2 years after a public inquiry started investigating cost overruns of the $12.7 billion dam. A scathing final report accuses the former Progressive Conservative government of failing to protect the best interests of the province. The project is 2 years behind schedule and about double its original cost.
Still ahead, understanding your sick leave policies. If your boss tells you to stay home, will you get paid? But first.
It became my therapist and my friend and my solitude and my comfort.
My conversation with Jan Arden about her place in Canadian music and what moves her now. Welcome back. After nearly 3 decades of heart-wrenching hits, Jan Arden is cementing her place in the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. She will be inducted Sunday night at the Juno Awards in Saskatoon. So you might associate that sort of honor with someone at the end of an illustrious career. But with Jan Arden, you sort of get the feeling she's just charging faster and further ahead all the time. We caught up at her home just outside Calgary.
I'm not pretty, but I'm smart and I'm bold and I'm brave.
Long known for delivering devastatingly real songs, Jan Arden is quickly becoming the hardest working woman in show business.
3, 2, 1, action.
She's the star of her own sitcom, Jan, but Arden isn't just diving into an acting career.
This is a very stressful situation.
I think that's Jan Arden.
She also has a weekly podcast, a new book, a new album, and an upcoming cross-country tour. The headliner, though, this Sunday's Junos and a ticket into the Canadian Music Hall of Fame.
The incomparable Jan Arden.
It's a big moment in a life of them, but something, or rather someone, will be missing that night. Jan's best friend, her mom, who died of Alzheimer's just over a year ago. The grief still grips, maybe always will. And yet, the humor and humility that make Jan Arden such a Canadian treasure still shine.
Look at the geese, you guys. They're fine. It's so late to be going south, you knuckleheads.
She's got a lot to say, so we caught up at her home just outside Calgary.
Welcome to Jan's Road.
Thank you.
How are you?
Funny meeting you here.
Yeah.
Is this your happy place? When people talk about, I need to go to my happy place.
I love getting out here and walking. It is usually quiet. We've found underpants along here.
Right.
I think this was at one time a little bit of a lover's lane. Old country roads.
Right. So since your mom has been gone, so it's been about a year.
Yeah, she died December 29th, 2019. 2018. 2018.
How have you been managing?
I think I'm doing pretty good for the most part. I would do anything to have a weekend to hang out and, have some food and eat some potato chips. But no, they were ready to go. And my mom, she left me with a sense of positivity. It wasn't a bad thing. So that's who I had as my guiding light.
They led you well.
Yeah, they both did.
They'd be so proud of you now, this Hall of Fame thing, I think. Of all the awards you've gotten, and I don't know if I'm just projecting, but don't you think this one
is the
would mean
biggest
a lot?
one? This is absolutely the biggest one. I have to say I was mind-boggled with the Order of Canada, but I love the sentiment of the Order of Canada because it's about doing positive things for your country, and I am a very proud Canadian.
Okay, so as much as I love the outdoors,
What do you mean?
Can we go inside?
What do you mean, that northern wind's kind of getting to you?
Just a little
you
bit.
Ontario girls?
I
No.
know.
Let's go light a fire.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go. Oh my gosh, it's deeper than you think.
A little bit.
Where's our snowshoes? There you go.
Well, thank you for letting us.
It's about -12, -13.
Yeah, I actually can't feel some of my parts, but I'm okay with that. For you, was it always going to be music that sort of set you free and set you on your path? Was that destined to be?
I don't know. I mean, I think I went into music because my dad was an alcoholic. And it seems like a weird thing, but he was such a big drinker that in order for me to stay out of his way, I went into the basement. Record player was down there. All the records were down there. My mom's little old guitar sitting in the corner that she tried to learn to play. And it became my therapist and my friend and my solitude and my comfort. I didn't recognize it at that time. I was 10 or 11 years old, but now that I get a chance to look back, it's very clear of how music, it transported me away from a very tumultuous family dynamic.
Were you scared of him?
Yeah, I was scared of my dad. We all were. You could ask any of my brothers. He was a fierce force to be reckoned with. But I'm kinder about it as he's been gone 4 years now, 4.5 years. And alcoholism is a disease. And I'm able to look at that now through my own eyes, because I've had drinking problems myself my whole adult life. But yeah, scary, scary guy.
How do you think, after seeing that as a child, alcohol seeped into your life?
God, I didn't want it to. I didn't want to be like that. I'm not like my dad so much as, I'm not a mean-spirited person.
Did you like drinking?
I loved drinking. The fallout was terrifying. I loved it and hated it. Ask anybody who's been a binger in their lives.
But you're completely sober now.
Sober. My mother's Alzheimer's helped me too, because I couldn't be hungover and look after her, and I just knew, I thought, why am I doing this?
You know what's hard sometimes to reconcile is that I feel like there are a couple Jans. So there's the Jan when I listen to your music, and I remember being in university and listening to your music, and it was the sound.
What were you thinking?
It was the soundtrack to so many hard things that were going on in life, right? Like it reminded you of some really tough stuff. And that doesn't seem to
fit.
It doesn't cross over with the sense of who you are. I mean, you're open and you're funny and you're positive and
like part of
King's honor, friend.
Part of that is, and it makes sense to me now, was
Be careful.
It was a form of therapy for me. I was always a funny kid. So I think when the stuff was happening with my family, my older brother was in trouble. He went down a different road than me, and I had found music, so I didn't want to be funny in the music. But it was good for me to write down things that bothered me. I did it without even knowing what I was doing. I was secretly writing all these songs, but it was almost like Dear Diary.
Yeah.
For me, it just had chords to it.
But there's an intersection, as I understand it, in your life where things are just getting great with your music, and then they got really hard with your brother.
Yeah.
In the same month.
Yeah, my brother was arrested for first-degree murder in the same month that I was signed to a record deal. So I often think about how my parents navigated that.
What happened with him?
He, it was a litany of things. He was sexually abused when he was a young teenager. We didn't find that out until 5 or 6 years ago, that he even spoke about it. So my dad's, a force of whatever he's doing, and he picked on Dre all the time. Dre just drank, and he said he would do any drug that he could find, anything. It started with, DUIs and drug charges and assaults and choking with intent, and I could go on and on and on. And I need to, preface all of this by saying he's always, maintained his innocence with this murder charge. And the Innocence program at the University of British Columbia vets thousands of cases every year, and they took him on a decade ago and are absolutely adamant and steadfast in telling our whole family that there's impossible that he committed this crime. And he's been there 27 years. When my mom was in the throes of her disease, I told her that he was out. Is he? I said, yeah, he's in his apartment. He's using all your doilies. He is. Well, he was such a homemaker. And I was so glad that I lied to her about that.
How are you doing without her?
I really miss my mom. But she just informs my every decision. She was such a champion of mine. Like, she just cheered me on my whole life. And I wish she could have hung around like a little bit longer, but been sane. But I lost my mom, like 10 years ago. Anyone that's gone through this realizes it's such a hard thing when they don't remember your childhood and they can't answer all your questions and they can't save you. Our parents are always supposed to save us. And sometimes we gotta save them.
Your new book called If I Knew Then.
Yeah.
If you knew what?
If I knew all of this, if I could have told myself at 25 or 30 years old, listen, you got so much stuff to wade through, but you're gonna come out of it the other side.
And who or what will be in your head in that moment at the Junos when you're inducted into the Hall of Fame?
Every single person that I ever met in my life that helped me or didn't help me, and how valuable they both were. Sometimes it's all the people that aren't cheering you on that make you even more boundless.
Well, that's what you are.
Our hands are frozen. There is no human warmth in her hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cold but warm at the same time. After the break, paid versus unpaid sick leaves, what you should know about your workplace policies during this coronavirus outbreak. We'll be right back. With so much we don't know about the new coronavirus and the outbreak changing daily, this message remains constant. Stay home from work if you're sick or were exposed. But as Cameron McIntosh tells us, many Canadians can't afford that.
I made a lot during the quarantine.
At least Gary Liu had time to perfect his cooking. He's symptom-free after 14 days of self-isolation upon returning from vacation in China.
I have to be responsible for the community. So that's why I'm stay home to do the quarantine.
He works in a federal lab. Turns out the isolation was unpaid.
And I was asked him and said, can we take the sick leave? I said, no.
He's not the only one who's faced the question, will your employer pay you? Turns out they don't have to. In federally regulated industries, employees are legally entitled up to 3 paid sick days. Among the provinces, only Quebec legislates paid sick days at 2. For just about everyone else, it comes down to agreements between employees and employers. Winnipeg-based Palliser Furniture has deep ties to Italy and China. All non-essential travel is canceled. As for workers traveling on personal time, they've been warned if they quarantine, they may not be paid.
Right now, we have no other choice. We have to try to be as cautious as we possibly can, as careful as we possibly can.
While some people can work from home, many cannot, like the service industry. Fair Work advocates in Ontario are pushing for 7 paid COVID sick days.
People have to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to pay their rent, put food on the table, take care of their kids, or stay home and not be paid.
The federal labor minister says it will be easier for quarantined and isolated workers to qualify for EI.
We have, as you know, as a government, reduced the wait periods from 2 weeks to 1 week.
While it cost him in the end, Liu says he's still glad he did it.
If I spread out the virus, it would be very bad.
Now, for anyone planning to travel, advice remains to watch for government advisories. Employers will likely use those to determine what kind of sick leave to grant. Cameron McIntosh, CBC News, Winnipeg.
After the break, searching for an alternative to single-use plastics. Why compostable doesn't always mean green. That's next.
I'm Jamie Poisson, and tomorrow on CBC's daily news podcast Front Burner, Jason Kenney endorses federal Conservative leadership candidate Erin O'Toole. We look at why Alberta's premier is taking sides and what it means for the party. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. A federal ban on single-use plastics is coming, and many businesses and consumers are already looking for alternatives. But as Tashana Reed explains, plant-based compostable plastics are not necessarily the greener choice.
They can be made out of corn or sugarcane, cups, cutlery, and takeout containers designed to be tossed in the compost bin instead of the garbage. Here at this restaurant trade show in Toronto, compostable plastic suppliers are at every turn.
It's all natural, right? It's plant-based. It's going to go from the earth back to the earth.
Certified compostable means the product has been lab tested and is proven to break down within 3 months in a commercial composting facility. But certification is voluntary in Canada, and that means some products labeled compostable might not be.
There's two things I think we need to work on. First is getting stuff certified, and second is making sure that for all compostables, there are places where these can be composted.
While some institutions and commercial buildings have contracts with commercial composters, most municipal curbside programs in Canada don't accept compostable plastics in green bins. And they get sent to the landfill, where conditions aren't typically suitable for compostable plastics. This Ontario composting company is one of the few we found in Canada that processes compostable plastics.
A lot of these windrows right now are pushing anywhere from 75 to 78 degrees Celsius.
The company was asked to test compostable products for the National Arts Centre. It took 1 year of testing to find a product that met their standards.
Okay, so what do we see after 1 week?
So after 1 week, you can see inside of here, we've also got some traditional paper plates and things like that in here as well. But here's what that green cutlery looks like. It's very fragile, very breakable. Okay. One of these other sets of forks that are in here, no, they're knives. There's the knife. It's not breaking down at all, but that's marketed as a biodegradable product. Right. As we moved forward then a following week, you can see the green is breaking down very well again. It's further just a crumbles apart in your hand at this point.
Oh, wow. That green cutlery is one of the products the National Arts Centre chose for their facility. Only 3 weeks into their 8-week compost cycle, it's significantly broken down compared to the other compostable branded plastics. Finding the right compostable product and getting it to a facility that will process it are still big hurdles in Canada's complex waste management system. Tashana Reed, CBC News, Kingston, Ontario.
And here are some of the other stories making headlines tonight. Thousands of protesters were met with tear gas today in Venezuela as demonstrators rallied in what is expected to be the beginning of a series of escalating protests against the government of President Nicolas Maduro. Opposition leader Juan Guaido joined the march and led an impromptu session of the National Assembly. Maduro supporters held their own separate rallies in downtown Caracas. Russian President Vladimir Putin put forward political plans that would allow him to remain in power until 2036. He opened the door to constitutional changes that could let him rule until the age of 83 if he so desires. Otherwise, he'd need to step down in 2024 when his second consecutive term ends. Kremlin critics call this move a constitutional coup. Well, the second person ever to be cured of HIV has decided to go public with his identity. 40-year-old Adam Castillo, also known as the London patient, has been free of the virus for more than 2 years now after stopping treatment. He says he wants to be an ambassador of hope to the millions of people living with HIV. Castillo received a bone marrow transplant from an HIV-resistant donor.
When we come back, putting the handshake on hope.
Hey, Mayor Mike.
How are you?
Oh.
From politicians to everyday Canadians. That's next in tonight's Moment.
Well, because of the coronavirus outbreak, health officials have been suggesting that folks skip the handshake for a while. And while not everybody's on board, there are lots of people, from politicians to everyday Canadians, willing to get creative. So we wanted to ask a few Canadians what they've come up with, and that is our moment.
People are doing this in the air, or they're doing the elbow thing, or they're doing like, oh, hey,
but not really shaking hands because, I mean, we have to be careful, right?
In my office, we've kind of been doing like a little elbow bump.
It's an old habit. You reach out your hand when you're greeting somebody, and you know, if you see that they've gone rock and you're still with the old paper, I mean, you just take it for what it is.
So we are doing namaste rather than handshaking.
I have meetings all the time, so yeah, shake hands. Don't honestly think twice about it.
Oh, sorry, dat mag niet meer. Sorry. Nee. Over. Ik wil er nog verder. Zo, ja.
A lot of my friends and family are telling me not to. It's just like I work in a business environment, and that's kind of part of the day-to-day.
For the most part, people I know, I've been hugging them. So it's like, I don't even know. But I find some people also say, ask before you approach.
I see everybody hitting Purell left, right, and center, and once I see that, then I'm more than willing to give them a handshake.
With British courtesy, would definitely shake your hand.
See, so let me just say this. I understand all of the reasons why we ought not to be shaking hands, or at least scale back a little bit. I'm kind of with the last guy, though. I still shake hands all the time, but I just think I wash them after. That's maybe the best.
Well, so here's a little tip, because it's all about not touching your face, ultimately, right?
Yeah,
so we learned from doctors a while ago that if you really want to know how many times you touch your face, try for 10 minutes not putting your hands above your shoulders. I promise you, it is incredibly hard.
I believe you.
That is a national for March the 10th. Good night.
Good night. On the day Canada crossed the threshold of 100 coronavirus cases, Ottawa was explicit for the first time about what researchers say could be on the way.
Are you planning the worst?
Absolutely. Most cases would feel like a cold, but as many as 25 million Canadians could catch the virus. Daunting numbers calmed by expert advice.
Walking that fine line, being mindful but not going overboard.
With Canadian health, but also jobs and businesses in mind, the Prime Minister says his team is ready.
$1 billion COVID-19 response fund.
But is the world ready?
Alarming levels of inaction.
And so for the first time, these words from the WHO, the coronavirus is officially a pandemic. This is a special edition of The National. Good evening, I'm Adrienne Arsenault.
And I'm Andrew Chang. That declaration from the World Health Organization and that plan from the Canadian government are the starting points for our full hour of coverage on this rapidly spreading virus.
Tonight, we'll take on the urgent questions here at home and around the world. Hospitals are getting ready, and we've got an inside view. Community spread has begun in Canada. So what does that mean for your daily life? And the sports world was rocked tonight. The NBA has suspended its season. You'll have lots of questions, and our healthcare experts are standing by. They will be here on set to help throughout the program. But health isn't the only issue. We will look at the impact on jobs and markets. Let's begin our coverage in Ottawa with David Cochran.
It's $1 billion down payment for the battle against COVID-19, with the promise of more to come.
We will be there to support provinces. We'll be there to support businesses. We will be there to support Canadians through this difficult time.
Half of this money goes directly to provinces and territories to boost their health systems. There's hundreds of millions for coronavirus research, $100 million for public health measures such as testing and Indigenous health, and $50 million for equipment such as masks and gloves. Then there's the economic response.
No one should have to worry about their job if they have to be quarantined. No employer should feel like they have to lay off a worker because of the virus.
On that front, the government is waiving the 1-week period to get employment insurance benefits. It will explore financial support for Canadians who aren't eligible for EI and is prepared to help companies with credit and cash flow problems if the economic hit becomes severe. The idea is that removing financial worries will allow Canadians to follow medical advice.
The advantage of being in the Canadian system is that people will be supported to do what public health has asked them to do.
In essence, Canada is preparing for the worst while asking Canadians to do their best to help slow the virus. It's officially a pandemic, and projections show that without precautions, the spread can be severe.
So this is scientific evidence that is still not
firm. I will say that there are ranges of the potential infection for any population, and it is somewhere in the 30 to 70% category. It's important to remember, though, for the majority of people, this will feel like a cold or a flu.
Of course, Canada is still a long way from seeing numbers in that range, but as the experiences in other countries has shown, the escalation can be swift and severe. David Cochran, CBC News, Ottawa.
Let's take a look now at the Canadian cases. Canada has now reported at least 118 cases, 43 in Ontario, 46 in BC, where one person, a man in his 80s, has died. There are 19 cases in Alberta, 9 in Quebec, and New Brunswick reported its first case today. Now, most are considered mild, and the overwhelming majority are travel-related. But several of those new cases in Ontario do have officials especially concerned as they scramble to reverse engineer who some of those newly infected people came into contact with. Vicadopia explains.
The world's largest mining conference, thousands of people from more than 100 countries coming together to
shake hands with the world.
And they did, from industry people to Indigenous leaders, right on up to Ontario's Premier and the Prime Minister. Conference organizers took some precautions, and yet a man in his 50s who was there took the illness home to Sudbury. Health officials are scrambling to trace the source.
We do know that the individual did not travel abroad, so doesn't have a travel history. We are not aware that the individual was in contact with a known confirmed case. So these are worrisome. These are of concern.
Elsewhere, Ottawa's first case, a man in his 40s, homesick with symptoms after a trip to Austria. And across the province in Hamilton, a cancer doctor back from a Hawaiian vacation tested positive on Monday, but not before she saw 14 patients.
And we all know that they're a particularly vulnerable group of patients. And I think what it speaks to is our vigilance now, should any of these individuals develop symptoms, that we have an extremely low threshold to bring them in. 7
hospital staff are also in isolation. It's a lot for patients to process.
I'm trying not to panic at this moment. I mean, I think it was inevitable for it to spread. It was just a matter of time for it to come.
It's going to happen no matter what. This infectious disease doctor agrees, but he says avoiding large gatherings and keeping personal distance can help.
That gives the virus fewer opportunities to actually spread. And remember, the spread of this virus is not linear, it's actually exponential. So the spread of the virus is going up very quickly. It starts slow, but then it really gets going.
And there is no shortage for the virus to spread. It turns out that sick doctor in Hamilton also traveled with her husband, who's a surgeon at another hospital. Vicadopia, CBC News, Toronto.
Now, we have Dr. Alison McGeer joining us. And Dr. McGeer, you were instrumental in helping manage the SARS outbreak here in Canada back in the early 2000s. What should Canadians be bracing for right now?
So what's really different from the SARS outbreak, the SARS outbreak was very focused in hospitals and infections of healthcare workers. So also a serious problem, but very different. This is more like an influenza pandemic, where the problem is community infections, and our issue in hospitals is not necessarily that healthcare workers aren't at risk, but that it's the extra number of patients that we will have to care for in healthcare workers. So the two issues are pressure on the healthcare system, and then the disruption of work, because so many people who are not seriously ill are ill enough to stay home.
But when it comes to the community spread issue that you were just mentioning, is there a point at which you would imagine we would see more proactive measures being taken? And I'm thinking about school closures, cancellations of events, that sort of thing.
Yes, and I think we're already beginning to see that happening with people canceling concerts and hospitals canceling large meetings, and I think we will see more of that. You know, at the moment, because what we want to do is slow this down, we're not going to make it go away. But if we can slow it down, it'll be better. And so we're starting, and I think people can expect over the next few weeks to see more of those cancellations.
Dr. McGeer, thanks so much.
Let's move to the United States, where the number of cases has jumped more than 1,000% since the start of the month. The U.S. has now reported over 1,200 cases, at least 35 of them fatal. The largest clusters in California, New York, and Washington. That's the hardest hit state so far, with over 365 cases and at least 29 deaths. 12 other states have now recorded at least 10 infections. Well, tonight, Donald Trump announced he is tightening U.S. borders even further.
To keep new cases from entering our shores, we will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days. The new rules will go into effect Friday at midnight.
So the travel ban will not include the United Kingdom. Trump also said some taxpayers and businesses will get an extra 3 months to pay their federal taxes to help blunt the impact of the virus. Today, fear of COVID-19 ended the longest-running bull market in U.S. history. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dipped into a bear market today after losing more than 20% from recent highs. Canada's TSX is also now in bear territory. Well, the rapid spread of COVID-19 is driving drastic new measures across the U.S. Today, Stephen D'Souza traveled north of Manhattan, where a prosperous bedroom community is struggling to contain an outbreak.
Inside the containment zone, life can be lonely. Banks are closed, and those who stay open try to stay clean. And some people question if it's all an overreaction.
Tell you we're bringing a National Guard, and you say, what the hell's going on here? You know, it's a war area. You know, it's not.
The synagogue is the epicenter of one of the biggest COVID-19 clusters in the U.S. The majority of cases in New York State traced to one patient who worshipped here. With hundreds in voluntary quarantine, on Tuesday the state's governor announced a containment zone, spreading out in a 1-mile radius around the synagogue. Starting tomorrow, the National Guard will be on the ground, cleaning public spaces and delivering food. Schools will be shut down, large gatherings banned. But there won't be military checkpoints, so people can come and go freely.
We have students who are in school and their sibling schools are closed, so I don't see how it's really containing anything.
I think it's going to be good. I don't think it's not going to be martial law or anything along those lines.
Across the U.S., more desperate measures. Seattle took the extraordinary step of closing all schools for 2 weeks. San Francisco and San Jose banned gatherings of more than 1,000, including sporting events.
It's about making sure that we reduce and eliminate the spread.
New York joined Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia in canceling St. Patrick's Day parade set for next week. While many colleges and universities are closing campuses and going online.
I maybe won't be able to finish my freshman year the way I wanted to, but I also sympathize and understand where the university is coming from.
Back in New Rochelle, the containment zone is causing confusion, but people just hope it works.
The unknown is the big factor here, and nobody has any answers.
A public health experiment that may soon be replicated across the country. Stephen D'Souza, CBC News, New Rochelle, New York.
So the U.S. president remains under fire today for having overstated his country's capacity to test for COVID-19. Katie Simpson did some digging into that and found a frightening mess.
Lawmakers summoned the country's top public health officials for what turned into a heated hearing on the White House's handling of coronavirus.
This administration was not prepared for this crisis, and it put lives at risk, American lives at risk.
The president on March 6th told the people in my district publicly that the tests were ready. Anybody who wants a test can go be tested. So my constituents went to their local health centers, went to their hospitals. There were no tests. Zero.
Anybody that needs a test can have a test.
Despite assurances from the president, the U.S. has struggled to develop and roll out widespread testing, and there's no clear explanation why, when other countries, including South Korea, are testing 10,000 people a day. There is added frustration in Seattle after the New York Times reported officials there wanted to ramp up testing more than a month ago, but couldn't get regulatory approval.
It delayed actually quarantining people or keeping people contained, and it enabled some of the spread that happened in the city of Seattle.
It makes me feel scared, actually, that the response is so disorderly.
Robin Schulman started showing symptoms after returning home to New York City from a trip to Toronto where she may have been exposed. But her local hospital refused to test her, and doctors gave her contradictory advice about whether she needed to self-isolate. Turns out she doesn't have coronavirus, but only got a test after she told health officials she was going public with her story.
It just seems that there's a level of chaos and disorder in the system that is not prepared to deal with mass numbers of very sick patients.
Up to 4 million test kits are supposed to be available by the end of the week, but there's no information on where they're going, who can access them, and how quickly more tests will be produced. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
So that's the United States. Let's talk Canada. Dr. Susie Hoda is here. Doctor, how is it decided who gets tested here?
So right now, what our message is if you've been traveling outside of Canada and then you develop symptoms of a respiratory infection, so cough, fever, shortness of breath, those kinds of symptoms, then you could be tested for COVID-19. We're trying to cast a very wide net. And so a simple test, a nasopharyngeal swab can be done, and results can be available within 24, 48 hours in general.
You can't just get one if you want.
That's right. You need to have symptoms. You need to be evaluated by a medical professional to decide that.
Is it your understanding that there are enough tests available for those who need them, and that as this trajectory changes, there will continue to be enough tests?
So there are enough tests for people who need it at the moment, but tests are not infinite. We know that there is a limited supply, and we have to use them judiciously. So our testing strategy will change over time, not just based on that, but what makes sense in terms of the evolution of the pandemic.
So some countries are doing things like having drive-through testing, or in Israel, they will go to the people who require the test. Is that on the table here?
I think anything's on the table to try and offload the healthcare system from being overburdened by this. So we're trying to explore all kinds of strategies to actually support the right kind of testing.
Okay, Dr. Hoda, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Now let's zoom out and take a look at the global picture, which has changed radically since the outbreak began. To date, there are about 120,000 confirmed cases around the world, most still in China. But a really big concern, clusters in Italy, with at least 12,000 confirmed cases and 200 deaths in one day. Iran has more than 9,000 cases, and South Korea has at least 7,700. In Europe, there is a patchwork response. So far, Italy has taken the most drastic measures to curb the outbreak, but other countries are starting to follow suit. Briar Stewart explains.
On the second day of Italy under full lockdown, there were long lines at grocery stores. Now, one of the few places people are allowed to go. We should all stay at home for 2 weeks, this man said. Only by not leaving home can we return to a normal life. Italy is shutting down all shops except for grocery stores and pharmacies. Restrictive, yes. And Italy's government believes its neighbors should follow suit.
We need a common strategy in Europe, and probably we should take example from China and even from us.
Denmark has shut down schools and universities, but across Europe, each country has its own approach. Austria has banned Italians from entering the country, but Germany won't be doing the same. Even though Angela Merkel said as many as 70% of Germans could catch the virus. In the UK, no mass restrictions on events or crowds, but more disinfecting.
The National Health Service is ramping up testing across the UK. Before, staff were doing about 1,500 tests a day. Now they'll be doing 10,000, including at centers like this one.
Behind this gate, testing is done by drive-through. There are now more than 450 cases of COVID-19. Among the infected, a junior minister for health. Today, the government promised billions to fight the coronavirus.
That's the real risk.
But this professor says the UK's approach is laid back compared to Italy, and it's too soon to tell how effective it will be.
It will really depend what will happen over the coming, I would say, coming year, or the coming 12 months. And it might be seen as wonderful responses, or it might be seen as disastrous decisions.
And tomorrow, the UK government will hold another emergency meeting. And afterwards, officials could announce new measures to try and delay the spread of the virus. Briar Stewart, CBC News, London.
Companies across the country are preparing for their employees to work from home.
We all carry a bit of a responsibility.
Up next, we continue our special coverage on the pandemic. From workplaces to sporting events, what is being done to prevent the spread of COVID-19?
Plus, we're inside the emergency room.
Running drills on the worst case scenario.
What you can expect if you wind up in the ER.
And later, on the road to recovery.
I feel like I'm in prison because, nobody can come see me. I can't.
A patient in quarantine shares his story. We're back in 2. Returning to our special coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic tonight, governments and healthcare systems are quickly trying to adapt, and so are workplaces. As Thomas Daigle tells us, in Canada and around the world, employees are being asked to work from home.
It may look like March break started early, but this BC tech company is actually near full force. Most of the staff are working from home.
We all carry a bit of a responsibility to make sure that we're not part of this virus spreading faster.
Greg Malpass told about 1,000 workers to stay away as a precaution against COVID-19. Instead, they're using video conferencing and other technology to remain connected. His firm is following in the footsteps of Silicon Valley giants like Google, Apple, and Facebook, all suggesting employees work from home. Canadian e-commerce company Shopify is the latest, directing 5,000 staff to work remotely as of next week, canceling business trips and conferences. The Prime Minister himself floating it as a solution to help stop the spread.
We need to make sure that everyone is given the tools they need.
But so-called telecommuting only succeeds if, like Haley Laxer, your job can be done at a computer or over the phone. Diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, her immune system is already weakened, so she can't risk catching the coronavirus.
My life depends on me working from home these days. It really is a matter of life and death.
A fear of spreading the virus pushed Scotiabank to send home staff from this building in downtown Toronto. Someone inside tested positive, and the company is being extra cautious.
You just go to click.com.
So is Peter Flashner's employer. There's no sign of COVID-19 at his office, but they're set up to work remotely anyway.
I don't think we'll go back as a society to being the same as we were before. I think working from home will be a lot more of an accepted feature.
He says there's virtually no loss in productivity at home, except maybe when the dog's hungry.
Come here. Sit.
Thomas Daigle, CBC News, Toronto.
See you around. Getting people to work from home is about protecting the community, and often the most vulnerable in the community are the elderly. So joining us now, we have Dr. Samir Sinha. And so if I'm in regular contact with an elderly loved one, what is the best way to protect them?
Right now, the best way that we recommend protecting our elderly is to make sure that they're up to date on all their vaccinations, like their flu shot, their pneumonia shot, for example, because we're still in flu season as well. Making sure that everyone's washing their hand, and that if any one of us is actually sick, that we're actually limiting contact. Right now, there is no real threat to meeting each other because we don't have widespread community transmission in Canada yet. But right now, we recommend people see each other. And again, if you're visiting an older loved one, have you gotten your flu shot as well?
Right. And when you talk about visiting loved ones, I mean, granted that we don't have widespread community transmission here in Canada, I do think of a place like Washington where the governor has imposed sort of stricter measures around care homes in terms of limiting visitors. Is that something that you think may happen?
It may happen, right? And right now, we haven't had that guidance from the Public Health Agency of Canada. And so right now, while the President of France has said, don't visit the elderly, we know that this is an important time for, we want people to stay connected as is appropriate. But if things evolve, and if a care home has an outbreak, then you might be instructed that it's not appropriate to visit.
Okay, and Dr. Sinha, you will be sticking around with us because when we come back, we will put your questions on the pandemic to our panel of doctors.
And then later, a CBC News exclusive.
It's going to be really quick. Take a big breath in. That's it. It's all done.
What happens if you end up in the ER with symptoms of COVID-19? We'll take you through the steps next.
Welcome back. Now that a global pandemic has been declared for COVID-19, you have been sending us more questions than ever. So we want to get through as many of them as we can for you tonight. Joining me now, we have Dr. Susie Hoda, Dr. Samir Sinha, and across from me, Dr. Allison McGeer. Dr. Hoda, I want to maybe start with a broad question. The significance of the declaration today, that this is in fact a global pandemic. What should we make of that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it brings us to speak in common language. But fundamentally, it doesn't really change anything that we're doing. We've been preparing for this kind of event for quite a while now, and really just making our decisions based upon what's happening across the world and in our local regions.
Yet this comes on the same day, Dr. McGeer, where the President of the United States, Donald Trump, just declared that there would be a travel ban of people coming from Europe to the United States. And the UK, I understand, is an exception. Is that the right way to go at this point?
So I think what the science tells you is that travel bans are not nearly as effective as you think they might be. And I think we, for instance, in Canada, should be really pleased and proud of our government for holding on to the science-based approach to what works and what doesn't work. And I think for all of us countries at the moment, I think we really need to be focused on what we need to do to protect ourselves from community transmission in our countries, as opposed to worrying about what happens with other people coming from other countries to us.
Well, let me push the question a little bit further. I mean, you talk about spread within our countries. Well, let's talk about Canada and the United States. Do you ever foresee a day where the Canada-US border could be closed down? Because in a way, we're sort of like one country. You can feel that way.
Yeah. I think we're probably not going to do that, in part because we recognize that travel restrictions are one piece of public health interventions that might slow progress down. So there's a bit of a temptation to say now that because we have so many fewer cases in Canada than some places in the United States, that we might worry about travelers from the United States. But again, that kind of restriction might delay our outbreak by a week, maybe even 10 days.
Right.
And the damage that it does is probably just not worth that week's delay, and it's only a week's delay.
Dr. Sinha, at this stage in the game, with what we know, how much more dangerous is this coronavirus compared to something like, say, the seasonal flu?
Yeah, well, I mean, when we compare things like SARS versus coronavirus versus the flu, we know that SARS, for example, killed 50% of older people who would get this. Right now, we're seeing the rates of about 15% in the elderly. So less deadly than say, SARS, but it's 7 times more deadly right now than the flu. So it's something we need to be worried about. But again, many Canadians right now haven't even gotten their flu shot. Right. And so we should do things we can protect ourselves against right now.
But and I remember you mentioned just a few moments ago the importance of getting the flu shot. You also mentioned the pneumonia vaccine. Is there any sense that either of those two things help protect particularly against this coronavirus?
Not particularly against the coronavirus. Right now there's work going on for a vaccine against that. Right. But what we do know is that if you get COVID, for example, you might also get a co-infection with a bacterial pneumonia or potentially influenza. So the thing is, by maximizing your protection against other things that we know we have tools against, that's how you can best protect yourself overall.
If you do get COVID-19, how do you tell the difference between that and something like, say, the common cold or even the flu?
There's a lot of overlap in the symptoms, especially since 80% of people with COVID-19 have fairly mild symptoms that, can have runny nose, sore throat, cough, fever. So really it comes down to the testing.
That's the only way. There's no way to tell just from the symptoms that you have.
Just from the symptoms, it's very difficult to distinguish between the two.
Do we know if you get sick from COVID-19, whether you can get sick again from it once you've recovered, or do you develop a kind of immunity from it? What do we know on that front, Dr. McGeer?
We do know that you make antibodies pretty quickly when you get infected, and they look like what they're called neutralizing antibodies. So they look like antibodies that should protect you from reinfection. But the truth is, until we can actually test it, until we have a group of people who've had it once and been observed to be exposed, we're not going to know for sure. So that's some months away, probably.
And along the lines of this question, and Dr. Hoda, maybe I'll put this one to you. One of the questions we actually got recently was if wider community spread is inevitable, this person's asking, should I try to catch COVID-19 now in order to not overwhelm the system? later on down the road.
Yeah, that kind of a strategy is not something we're encouraging at all. I think what we're still trying to do is prevent people from getting it as much as possible, especially those who could be vulnerable to get really the more severe illness, the elderly, those with other health conditions that put them at risk, like heart disease, lung disease, diabetes, cancer, and immune suppression.
Dr. Sinha, how are you advising your patients in terms of how long the virus can survive on surfaces? And so think of desks, or think of phones that people have, or think of their clothes, you know.
Yeah, right now what we know is that it can last for hours or even sometimes days. And so if you're touching surfaces that other people may have touched, for example, it's a good opportunity to clean them and make sure that you wash your hands. And those are some of the things we're recommending right now. But we're talking about maybe hours to days. And so that's why it's just best to, make sure that surfaces that other people might touch, you're keeping clean.
Step on up.
Is there a point in the very near future, Dr. Hoda, that you think that folks should really be thinking about avoiding high traffic areas? So shopping malls, movie theaters, public transit, that sort of thing.
Yes. I mean, those are what we call sort of social distancing, or, just trying to keep people from congregating in areas where you can have a lot of traffic, a lot of, a lot of people together. And at that point, that point will be decided by public health and communicated to the public.
But you don't think we're necessarily at that point where we should all be reconsidering our plans?
No, not at this point. I mean, right now, at least in most parts of Canada, we haven't seen community spread. So, it's not until we see that it's more widespread that we would actually want to try and prevent people from being in close contact with each other.
When it comes to a lot of folks being together in the same place, Dr. McGeer, one of the recent questions we had was around cruise ships, and we know that these can be fairly sort of infectious places, for lack of a better word. But they were wondering if that's true for cruise ships, isn't it also true for the apartment building that I live in, the condo, the big sky? Thousands of people live there. We're all using the same elevator.
No, so completely different. If you think about a cruise ship, first of all, the space that you're living in is much smaller, right? You have a stateroom, okay, which has a bed in it and maybe a desk, and then the entire day you are out with other people. You're eating with other people. You're swimming with other people. You're, I don't know, playing pool with other people. So cruise ships are in fact very, very crowded environments. You have a lot of close contact with a lot of people, and a piece of this is just empiric evidence. We know that cruise ships are a huge problem for influenza outbreaks and gastroenteritis outbreaks. Right. That's the living example. That doesn't happen in your apartment building. So your apartment building is different.
I have time for one more question, and Dr. McGeer, I'll put this one to you as well. If once the weather starts to warm up, does that mean the virus will wane in any way?
I think the answer is we can hope. Many respiratory viruses do not transmit as well in temperate climates in the summer months. We actually don't know why, which makes it really hard to predict what might happen. And so I think there is reason to hope that we might get an abbreviated wave and then a break until the fall. But it's really just hope. It's not based on evidence, and it may just be that this virus will keep going right through the summer. And just speaking of hope, I can't help but think of the possibility of a cure, a vaccine. I suppose that's still a ways away as well. People have taken the example of Ebola, where a huge amount of effort went into accelerating a vaccine, and the world did an amazing job about getting a vaccine out, and it works. Hello. Okay, it's awesome, and so I think there are a lot of people that are hoping we can replicate that, but replicating that it still probably means a vaccine is, at a minimum, 18 months away. Dr. McGeer, Dr. Sinha, and Dr. Hoda, thanks so much for this.
And now, if it's time to call your health authorities about where to go for testing, don't let the whole process frighten you. It's actually quite simple and quick, as Christine Birak found out during a dry run in a CBC News exclusive.
Canadians are landing in emergency rooms asking if they have COVID-19.
Blue will be at top. Okay.
The University Health Network showed us what happens next, minus the wait.
Hi, so we have a patient with a positive screen named Christine.
The screener shares symptoms and travel history with a nurse who prepares to take a look.
Now, the person that's being screened is supposed to sit about 2 meters from other people that are in the waiting room.
Hi, Christine.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Cherry. I'm one of the nurses here. you can please follow me.
More questions followed by a quick exam.
So we're gonna do your blood pressure.
The information then gets passed on to the doctor.
She or he will decide whether to do a swab or not to test for COVID.
After a quick check, the ER doctor makes the call. A nasal swab goes down the throat or up through the nose.
So if you can pull down your mask.
Okay.
Am I swabbing?
I've never had this done before.
Yes, it's startling, but it's over in a moment.
That's it. It's all done.
The results take 24 hours, but doctors urge people not to just show up in hospital.
We need to be very careful about is not overburdening the departments so that we can still look after the very sick people.
Staff are also preparing for those scenarios.
We also have been really running drills on the worst case scenario, which is that if a patient comes in with COVID-19 and is in a cardiac arrest situation.
If we could get some intubation medications.
It's a mannequin, but in case you missed it, it exhaled, spraying workers like a patient. Afterwards, UV light reveals how far germs can travel.
It's stressful. Yeah, it's very stressful and anxiety-provoking.
Reminding everyone, as this outbreak evolves, proper precautions must be taken by healthcare workers and patients alike. Christine Birak, CBC News, Toronto.
So where do you go if you think you're at risk? Well, the answer depends on where you live, but don't worry, we've done some research to help you out. Wherever you are in Canada, first thing is, if you even think there's a chance you could be infected, officials want you to check your recent history. Have you come in contact with anyone who's been in one of the affected areas in the last 14 days, or with anyone in contact with someone else who has been? Step 2. Do you have any of these symptoms? Fever, fatigue, dry cough, headache, shortness of breath, or diarrhea? Now keep in mind, it can take anywhere from 2 to 14 days after exposure for the symptoms to show up. So if you feel any of those, self-isolate and check in with health authorities by phone first, and they'll tell you where to go. Don't just show up at your local hospital. In Ontario, call Telehealth Ontario at 1-866-797-0000. In Quebec, call 811 to set up an appointment at one of the province's specialized COVID-19 clinics. In Manitoba, the numbers there to call are 204-788-8200 or 1-888-315-9257. For all other provinces and territories, calling 811 will direct you to officials who can confirm if you qualify for testing. And please remember, if you are told to go to get tested, call ahead to the hospital or clinic to alert them that you'll be coming. We'll get back to the coronavirus in a few minutes, but first, some of the day's other stories. Disgraced movie mogul Harvey Weinstein could very well spend the rest of his life in prison. He was sentenced to 23 years behind bars today after being convicted of rape and sexual assault. The Me Too movement calls it justice, but as Zulekha Nathu tells us, Weinstein's lawyer has a very different take.
She didn't speak, but Jessica Mann appeared triumphant. Mann was one of the 2 women involved in Harvey Weinstein's rape and sexual assault convictions.
The judge sent a message today that this type of behavior is something that any potential offender is going to have to consider.
Weinstein's defense team says they will appeal, calling the 23-year jail sentence
total unfairness. And
it's close to the maximum and 3 times the mean sentence for similar crimes in the state, according to Weinstein's lawyers.
That number spoke to the pressure of movements and the public. That number did not speak to the evidence that came out at trial.
More than 90 women have accused Weinstein of misconduct. Many view the case as a landmark decision for the Me Too movement. In a statement, the Time's Up organization said, the social change catalyzed by these survivors has been nothing short of transformational.
Weinstein's legal battles are far from over. He still faces charges here in Los Angeles for 2 incidents in 2013, including an allegation of rape. Prosecutors are trying to bring him back to LA to face them.
Lawyer Gloria Allred represents one of the women involved in the Los Angeles case who also testified in New York.
Now there are consequences to be remembered, and more potential consequences for Mr. Weinstein in the future.
For now, Weinstein is in the custody of Correctional Services, which will determine where the disgraced Hollywood producer will serve his sentence. Zuleyka Nethu, CBC News, Los Angeles.
Now, here are some of the other stories we are following tonight on The National. An investigation commissioned by the LA Opera determined a slew of sexual harassment allegations against Spanish opera star Placido Domingo are credible. He worked with the opera for more than 30 years until resigning last October after several allegations were first publicized. According to the findings, 10 women accused the legendary singer of inappropriate conduct dating back to 1986.
This is an investigation that needs to keep on going.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs welcomed Iran's decision today to transfer the black boxes from Flight 752 to Ukraine for analysis. This puts an end to a 2-month standoff over the fate of the plane's voice and data recordings. The jet was shot down by the Iranian military in January. All 176 people on board were killed, including 57 Canadians.
Last night, obviously, was not a good night for our campaign.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders was brought a resounding defeat last night, losing pivotal primaries to Joe Biden in Missouri, Idaho, Mississippi, and Michigan. The Vermont senator, once the front runner in the Democratic leadership race, is now trailing the former vice president by roughly 150 delegates. However, Sanders has vowed to fight on and is now preparing for the first one-on-one debate of the campaign Sunday.
After the break, we return to our special coverage of the pandemic.
We would recommend that there not be large crowds.
So what that means for sporting events and the fans, even March Madness is affected. Stay with us.
I'm Jamie Poisson, and tomorrow on CBC's daily news podcast, Front Burner, the trial has begun for 4 men accused of murdering 298 people in the MH17 crash over Ukraine. We look at the pursuit for justice. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Good day to you.
A dramatic move late tonight from the National Basketball Association shows just how quickly the coronavirus is having a big impact. The league has suspended its season until further notice. The decision came shortly after a game between Oklahoma City and Utah was called off at the last minute when one of the players tested positive for the illness. It's the latest sporting event to be upended by the coronavirus. Now, earlier today, the NCAA announced that March Madness will go ahead, but only essential staff and limited family will be allowed in arenas. And basketball isn't the only sport looking to make changes. Jamie Strachan is in Dunedin, Florida, with the latest.
At Blue Jays spring training, there is little talk about the coronavirus. Instead, the focus is on the season ahead.
I don't think we really quite understand what's going on right now, and so to just be as safe as possible is the best bet.
Major League Baseball has implemented small changes here. No media in the clubhouse, and Blue Jay manager Charlie Montoya spoke to the media behind a barrier. Player interviews are supposed to be done at a distance, but it's not being enforced.
The coronavirus obviously having a huge impact on the world of sports, the way fans watch games and interact with players. But here at Blue Jays spring training and across Major League Baseball, it seems old habits die hard.
Some players are choosing not to sign autographs, but most are.
We've met quite a few ball players already, and they've come to us.
High fives and handshakes are still common, and dugouts are still as dirty as ever. But Major League Baseball may escalate measures and maybe open the season in front of empty stadiums. Not a popular idea.
Different leagues have mentioned that and all, and I think the overall consensus of everybody is that it just wouldn't feel like a real game.
Blue Jays general manager Ross Atkins doesn't see things getting to that point.
We're not coming up with contingency plans that specific on something as drastic as that measure.
Atkins says the team is taking its cue from Major League Baseball and relying on the best information available. That's how the Blue Jays are proceeding for now. Jamie Strachan, CBC News in Dunedin, Florida.
And this story continues to develop. Following a decision by Ohio's governor to limit mass gatherings, the NHL's Columbus Blue Jackets have announced upcoming home games will be closed to the public. Meanwhile, the Quebec government has called off the World Figure Skating Championships. They were scheduled to start next week at the Bell Centre in Montreal. Skate Canada says it respects the decision.
And after the break, we hear from a patient with coronavirus.
And I said, I feel like y'all just sent me home to die. I said, I'm getting worse. I'm getting worse.
His message from quarantine is next in our moment. Clay Bentley is an American from the state of Georgia, and a few days ago he tested positive for coronavirus. He believes he contracted the virus from his church choir. So he went to the hospital last week feeling sick, but he hadn't been traveling, so the hospital didn't test him for COVID-19. Now he's a patient under quarantine. He spoke out today from his hospital room, and his message is our moment.
I feel like I'm in prison because, nobody can come see me. I can't even walk out of the room. They asked me if I'd been out of the country, if I'd been to China, different places in the world, and I told them no. I don't go anywhere. I'm retired. So they sent me home on Monday. Well, I progressively got worse.
Need help?
Over the next few days. And I said, I feel like y'all just sent me home to die. I said, I'm getting worse. I'm getting worse. And once I got back to the hospital, then they started realizing that I probably have the coronavirus, and it's very lonely. It's a lonely place to be sick, and you can't even talk to your own family. It's been a long road, but I'm getting through it. I'm improving daily.
And you can hear him there. He really is hurting. He says he has fluid in both of his lungs.